She arrived at his palace in the dead of night, drenched in rain, her eyes filled with silent desperation. The prince, known for his kindness, offered her shelter, never questioning her past. But he never imagined that the woman he had taken in was no ordinary stranger. She was a runaway bride, fleeing from a fate she refused to accept. As secrets unravel and hidden truths come to light, will the prince stand by her side, or will her past catch up before she can escape it forever? The rain poured relentlessly, drenching her fragile frame as she stumbled through the darkened forest. Every step was a battle against the thick mud that clung to her worn-out slippers. Her heart pounded, not just from exhaustion but from fear that they were still following her. She had run without looking back, the echoes of the grand wedding hall still haunting her ears. The vows she had refused to take, the heavy jewelry discarded on the palace floor, and the gasps of the nobleman as she fled, everything blurred into a single desperate thought. Keep going. Do not stop. By the time she saw the towering walls of the prince's palace, her body had nearly given up. The golden lights flickered behind the high windows, their warmth taunting her as she stood drenched and shivering. This was her only hope. Gathering her last bit of strength, she raised her trembling hand and knocked. For a moment, there was silence, just the howling wind and the rain beating against the wooden doors. Then, the sound of footsteps. A deep voice called from the other side. "Who goes there?" She hesitated. Giving her real name was too dangerous. "Please," she whispered hoarsely. "I need shelter." The doors creaked open, and a guard's torch illuminated her soaked form. His eyes widened in surprise at the sight of a lone woman, dressed in fine but tattered silk, standing at the gates of royalty in the dead of night. "Who are you?" the guard demanded. She could barely hold herself up. I have nowhere else to go." Before he could question her further, another voice interrupted. "What's going on here?" A tall figure stepped forward, his royal presence unmistakable even in the dim light. Prince Idris. She had heard of him before, an honorable ruler, fair and just. But now, as his piercing gaze met hers, she feared what judgment he might pass upon her. The prince studied her for a moment, then spoke with surprising gentleness. "She's freezing. Bring her inside." The guards hesitated, but a single look from him was enough to silence any doubts. Moments later, she found herself within the grand palace walls, the warmth of the hearth wrapping around her like a silent embrace. Servants rushed to bring towels, warm drinks, and dry clothes, but she barely noticed. The exhaustion was too great. Prince Idris stood nearby, watching as she was tended to. "You arrived at my doorstep in the middle of a storm," he finally said. "Not as a guest, not as a messenger, but as someone in distress." She lowered her gaze. I cannot say much, Your Highness. Only that I had nowhere else to turn." His sharp eyes flickered with something unreadable, but he did not press her further. "Then you will stay here until you can." The kindness in his words nearly shattered her. She had expected skepticism, interrogation, even rejection. Instead, he had given her what she needed most: safety. As the night wore on, she lay in the unfamiliar comfort of a grand chamber, staring at the high ceiling, listening to the rain continue its relentless fall. She had escaped. For now. But she knew this was only the beginning. The past she had fled was not far behind. And soon, she would have to decide whether to keep running, or to finally stand and fight. The palace was unlike any place she had ever known. Vast corridors lined with golden lanterns, the scent of fresh jasmine lingering in the air, and guards standing at every turn. Yet, despite its magnificence, she felt like a shadow within its walls. Days passed, and no one questioned her presence. Prince Idris had ordered that she be treated as a guest, yet she knew she was still an enigma to everyone around her. The servants whispered as she passed, curious about the mysterious woman who had arrived in the middle of a storm. But no one dared ask her where she had come from or why she was there. She kept to herself, wandering the gardens in the early mornings and retreating to her chambers before nightfall. Every time she caught a glimpse of her reflection, she barely recognized herself. Gone was the finely dressed bride, adorned in jewels and silken veils. In her place was a woman draped in the simple fabrics the palace maids had given her, her face no longer painted with gold but marked with the weight of her secrets. Yet, despite her efforts to remain invisible, there was one person who noticed her. Prince Idris. He was not a man easily distracted, but she had caught his attention. He would often find her in the courtyard, seated beneath the large tamarind tree, her gaze lost in thought. At first, he observed from a distance, as though trying to unravel the mystery she carried. But soon, curiosity led him closer. One afternoon, he approached her as she sat by the reflecting pool. "You have been here for weeks now," he said, his voice steady yet gentle. "And still, I do not know your name." She hesitated. The truth was dangerous, but a lie could be worse. "My name is Layla," she finally said, offering only half of the truth. "Layla," he repeated, testing the name on his tongue. "And what is it that you seek in my palace, Layla?" Her fingers brushed the surface of the water, watching the ripples distort her reflection. "A new beginning." The prince studied her, his dark eyes filled with quiet understanding. He did not press her for more, nor did he show suspicion. Instead, he simply sat beside her, allowing the silence between them to speak. As the days passed, their encounters became more frequent. Sometimes, he would find her tending to the palace gardens, her hands buried in the soil as she helped the maids plant new jasmine bushes. Other times, he would see her sitting with the children of the palace staff, telling them stories of distant lands. She had expected the prince to be indifferent, but instead, he listened. "Where did you learn to tell such tales?" he asked one evening as she entertained a group of children with stories of desert warriors and enchanted rivers. She smiled, the first genuine one in weeks. "My mother used to tell them to me when I was a child." Idris leaned against a pillar, arms crossed, watching her with a rare softness in his expression. "You are unlike anyone I have met before, Layla." His words unsettled her. He was beginning to see her, not just as a woman in need of shelter, but as someone who intrigued him. And that was dangerous. Because no matter how much she longed to believe in this fragile peace, she knew it could not last. Every night, she lay awake, staring at the ornate ceiling, the weight of her secret pressing down on her. She had run from an arranged marriage, defying the will of powerful men. If they found her, they would not be merciful. More than that, if Idris discovered the truth, that the woman he had given refuge to was a runaway bride meant for another prince, it would change everything. She could not allow herself to grow attached. Yet, despite every warning she whispered to herself, she could not ignore the way her heart quickened when Idris was near. And she feared that, soon, she would have to make a choice. To stay and risk everything. Or to run. Once again. The palace had begun to feel like a sanctuary, a place where Layla could breathe freely, if only for a fleeting moment. But deep inside, she knew that peace was fragile, an illusion waiting to be shattered. The truth had a way of catching up. And hers was closing in. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Layla sat by the reflecting pool, her thoughts restless. The breeze carried the scent of blooming jasmine, but even the fragrant air could not ease the weight pressing upon her heart. Prince Idris had joined her, as he often did now. His presence had become a source of unexpected comfort, but tonight there was something different in the air. "You are troubled," he observed, watching her carefully. She forced a smile, unwilling to admit how close to the truth he was. "Just lost in thought." "Then let me give you better thoughts to get lost in," he said, his voice lighter, teasing. "Come, walk with me." Layla hesitated, but his outstretched hand left little room for refusal. She took it, and they wandered through the palace gardens, their footsteps slow, unhurried. "I never asked," Idris said after a moment, "what it is you wish for." Layla glanced up at him, her chest tightening. "Wish for?" "Yes," he continued, eyes fixed ahead. "Now that you are here, now that you have had time to breathe, what is it that your heart desires?" She wanted to tell him. To speak of freedom, of a life where she was not bound by duty, where her choices were her own. She wanted to tell him how much she longed to stop running, to finally belong somewhere. But before she could answer, a commotion erupted at the palace gates. The sharp clang of steel echoed through the air, followed by urgent voices. Idris turned, his entire posture shifting, his calm demeanor replaced by quiet alertness. "Stay here," he instructed, but Layla knew she could not. Something in her gut told her that the peace she had borrowed was slipping through her fingers. She followed him, her heartbeat loud in her ears. As they neared the entrance, the guards stood in tense formation, their hands gripping their weapons. And beyond them, A group of royal messengers stood, their robes bearing the colors of a kingdom Layla had tried so desperately to escape. Her breath caught. The man at the center of them stepped forward, his piercing gaze scanning the gathered crowd before landing directly on her. A slow, knowing smile curved his lips. "There you are." Layla felt the world tilt. No, it couldn't be. The man was not her would-be husband, but he might as well have been his shadow. The right hand of the very prince she had fled. "Who are you?" Idris's voice was sharp, commanding. The man bowed slightly, his smirk never fading. "A messenger, your highness. I come bearing news of an urgent matter." His gaze flicked back to Layla, his amusement unmistakable. "A matter that concerns a missing bride." Silence. It settled over the courtyard, thick and suffocating. Layla could feel Idris's stare burning into her, but she couldn't bring herself to meet it. The man continued, his voice smooth, deliberate. "You see, there was to be a grand wedding not long ago. A union between two kingdoms. But on the eve of the ceremony, the bride disappeared." Layla clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "We searched everywhere," the man went on. "Through valleys and across rivers. And yet, she remained a ghost. That is, until now." A sharp inhale from Idris. Layla could no longer avoid it. Slowly, hesitantly, she turned to face him. The betrayal in his eyes was worse than any punishment her former betrothed could have devised. "You lied to me." The words were not spoken in anger, but in quiet disbelief. Layla swallowed the lump in her throat. Idris sighed. "She is not who she claimed to be, your highness," the messenger interrupted. "She is a runaway. And she belongs to another kingdom." The words struck her like a blade. Belongs. The very thing she had fought against, the chain she had tried to break free from, had found her once more. Idris was silent, but his expression spoke volumes. Layla had prepared for this moment, had told herself she would be ready if the past ever caught up. But now, standing in the wake of her shattered refuge, she realized. She was not ready at all. The world around Layla felt as if it had collapsed. The moment she had feared the most had arrived, and there was no running this time. She stood frozen, her pulse hammering against her ribs as the messenger's words settled over the courtyard like a heavy storm cloud. She belongs to another kingdom. Prince Idris had not spoken since the truth had been revealed, but his silence was worse than anger. She could see it in his eyes, the weight of betrayal, the unspoken questions demanding answers. Finally, he turned to her, his voice measured, though laced with something she couldn't quite place. "Is it true?" Layla opened her mouth, but no words came. What could she say? That she had lied? That she had been too afraid to tell him the truth? That she had begun to care for him, for this palace, for the fleeting sense of safety she had found? Her silence was enough of an answer. The messenger smirked, as if savoring the moment. "You see, your highness, she was never just a traveler seeking shelter. She was a promised bride, bound to another. And now, it is time she fulfills her duty." The word duty sent a shiver down her spine. She turned to Idris, desperate, searching his face for anything that could tell her where he stood. Would he cast her out? Would he send her back, handing her over like a political token? He had no reason to protect her. No reason except— "Leave us," Idris ordered, his voice cutting through the thick tension. The guards hesitated, unsure whether they should allow the messengers to remain. But Idris's tone left no room for argument. Within moments, they stepped back, leaving only Layla and the prince standing in the now empty courtyard. The silence between them stretched unbearably. "You should have told me," he said finally. Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Would it have made a difference?" Idris exhaled sharply, running a hand through his dark hair. "I don't know. But I deserved to know the truth." Layla took a step forward. "I never wanted to deceive you, Idris. I only wanted to be free." He studied her, his jaw tightening. "And now, do you still want to run?" She swallowed hard, glancing at the palace gates where the messengers had stood. The past she had fled had found her. If she left with them, she would be nothing more than a bargaining piece, a woman married off for the sake of alliances. But if she stayed— Her voice was barely above a whisper. I don't want to go back. Something flickered in Idris's expression, something she had not dared to hope for. For the first time, he stepped closer, his presence warm despite the cool night air. Then don't. Her breath hitched. What? You asked if it would have made a difference, he said. Maybe it would have. Maybe it wouldn't. But what matters now is the choice before me. Layla held her breath. Idris's voice was firm, unwavering. I will not send you back. The words crashed over her like a wave. But I do not answer to them, he interrupted, his gaze burning into hers. I will not let them dictate what happens in my kingdom, and I certainly will not hand you over like a prisoner. Tears threatened to spill, but this time she let them. Idris. His hand found hers, his grip steady. You have been running for too long, Layla. Let me fight for you. She had never heard words like those before. No one had ever offered her a choice. No one had ever given her the chance to be more than what the world had forced upon her. And now, here he was, a prince, standing before her, ready to defy a kingdom for her sake. But what of your kingdom? She whispered. If you refuse, there will be consequences. Idris smirked slightly, the fire of a warrior in his eyes. Let them come. Layla felt her heart shift, the fear that had gripped her for so long loosening its hold. She had spent her life running, but now, for the first time, she wanted to stand still. With him. The decision had been made. When the messengers returned the next day, demanding the runaway bride be surrendered, they were met not with submission, but with the unwavering resolve of a prince who had chosen love over duty. And as Layla stood beside him, she knew. She had finally found a place where she belonged.